Here's a roughly 700-word expansion of keynote number 1. Without ending sentences and without headings, overconfidence has a way of sneaking in on days that feel predictable. A routine schedule lowers everyone's guard. People stop paying attention to details because nothing dramatic has happened in a while, and after enough smooth days, they start to believe nothing dramatic will. That was the mood in the training area that morning. The cadets moved with the loose confidence of people who felt they understood the rhythm. They had learned enough to feel familiar with the environment, but not enough to understand how fast it can turn on them. When someone feels a little bit skilled and a little bit bored, that's usually when trouble starts. The room itself encouraged that mindset. It was nothing special. Concrete floor, standard gear racks, the usual scuffed walls that marked years of drills. Nothing about it warned anyone that a serious mistake was coming. The cadets joked as they walked in, bumped shoulders, nudged each other with the kind of casual roughness that comes from feeling untouchable. They were young, strong, and eager to prove themselves. Those qualities can be useful, but they can also turn into something careless when mixed with a belief that you already know enough. Overconfidence doesn't usually announce itself. It hides under small behaviors. One cadet cutting a corner on safety checks. Another holding his rifle in a sloppy grip because he thinks he can correct his stance later. A third rolling his eyes when given instructions he thinks he's heard before. None of these things seem important alone, and that is what makes them dangerous. They add up quietly. The cadets weren't acting malicious. They were acting like people who had convinced themselves they couldn't possibly make a serious mistake. They thought the day would continue exactly as it had begun, slow and simple. There was also a kind of silent peer pressure working in the room. No one wanted to be the one who looked too cautious. They didn't want to appear nervous in front of each other, so they pushed the line a little more than they should have. It's a common problem in group training. One person takes a risk, and the rest follow because they don't want to look less bold. They think they're proving confidence, but what they're actually showing is inexperience. A seasoned person knows that the people who move quietly and precisely are the ones worth watching. The cadets hadn't learned that yet. The presence of a Navy SEAL should have been enough to shift their mindset. You don't need to know anything about military culture to understand the weight carried by someone who has gone through that level of training. But familiarity can dilute respect. The SEAL wasn't stomping around or barking orders. He carried himself with calm, almost understated control. The cadets misread that calm as softness. They mistook courtesy for weakness. Overconfidence often grows when people assume that a quiet expert is less capable than the loud ones. They didn't see the discipline behind his stillness. What made the situation even more unstable was that the cadets were trying to impress each other instead of focusing on the lesson. They were halfway listening, halfway joking under their breath, and fully convinced they were in no real danger. In their heads, the training rifles were just props. They forgot that any tool, even an unloaded one, can turn into a problem when handled with arrogance. They took liberties with their movements. One nudged another with a rifle butt. Another swung his around too fast while turning. Each action chipped away at the margin of safety that professionals rely on. There's a moment in every chain of events where someone could stop it. A breath of awareness, a second of hesitation, a quick thought like maybe I shouldn't do this. That moment passed unnoticed. The cadets were wrapped too tightly in the belief that nothing could go wrong. When a person is convinced they're in control, they miss the signs that they're not. They don't see how close they are to crossing a line. The cadets crossed it when one of them struck the SEAL with his rifle. He didn't swing it with full force. It was more like a show of rough humor, an attempt to get a laugh. But overconfidence doesn't care about intention. It only cares about impact. The strike cut through the room's relaxed atmosphere. Overconfidence always collapses quickly once reality pushes back. The cadets felt that shift, but by then the damage was done. The SEAL didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to posture or threaten. The lesson they were about to learn had already taken shape the moment they forgot where they were and who they were dealing with. Respect for experience isn't something you turn on and off. It's built into the way people move, speak, and handle themselves when the stakes are high. In places where danger is real, respect acts like a safety net. It keeps people alert, cautious, and aware of boundaries they shouldn't cross. When that respect slips, even for a moment, the whole environment changes. That's what happened with the cadets. They understood the idea of hierarchy. They knew what rank meant on paper, but they didn't yet understand the deeper kind of respect that comes from recognizing someone who has lived through situations most people only read about. They treated training like a controlled world with padded edges, believing nothing serious could happen as long as instructors were present. The cadets had been around experienced personnel before, but familiarity had softened their sense of seriousness. They knew the routines. They knew the rules. And because everything was predictable, they assumed it was safe to loosen up. This is a common trap for people early in their training. They're close enough to the real thing to feel proud, but not close enough to feel humbled. They see veterans as steady figures, not as people who carry years of hard-earned judgment. When someone like a Navy SEAL steps into the room, his presence should signal something different. Even without saying a word, someone with that background carries a weight that changes the atmosphere. The cadets didn't sense that weight. They saw a calm man and mistook his calm for a lack of authority. Experienced people often carry themselves with a kind of controlled quiet. They don't need to dominate a room because they've already been tested in ways most people never will be. Their confidence isn't loud. It's grounded. They watch more than they talk. They evaluate before they react. This kind of presence can confuse people who think authority is always expressed through volume or aggression. The cadets expected a stereotype, and what they got was subtlety. Instead of increasing their respect, they let their guard drop even further. They began treating the setting like a friendly practice instead of a place where discipline is non-negotiable. The reason respect matters so much in environments like this is simple. Experience fills the gaps where training ends. Manuals can teach procedures. Drills can teach repetition. But only experience teaches judgment. Only experience teaches how fast a situation can change. When someone with real-world background gives a direction, they're pulling from every moment that taught them the cost of hesitation, the danger of shortcuts, and the value of maintaining control even when others don't. Ignoring that experience isn't just disrespectful. It's risky. The cadets didn't intend to dismiss that experience. They just hadn't lived enough to grasp its significance. Their world was still theoretical. They saw tasks, not consequences. They saw instructors, not survivors. This difference in perspective created a blind spot. They believed their confidence was strength. An experienced person would have recognized it as a warning sign. Confidence without perspective is unpredictable. It makes people bold in the wrong moments and relaxed in the wrong spaces. Respect acts as a counterbalance. It keeps people grounded when their ego starts to drift. There was a specific moment when the gap between experience and inexperience became obvious. The SEAL had been watching the cadets with quiet attention, noting their stance, their handling, their shortcuts. He wasn't irritated. He was reading them the same way someone reads a landscape before moving through it. Every shift in posture, every careless movement told him exactly how the room might unfold. Meanwhile, the cadets weren't reading him at all. They saw a man leaning against a table, hands loose, posture calm. They didn't recognize the level of control behind that stillness. They didn't see the trained awareness that never fully turns off in someone who has worked in high-risk environments for years. Respect would have changed everything. It would have tightened their stance. It would have sharpened their focus. It would have reminded them that this wasn't play. It would have made them think twice before using their rifles as props for jokes or roughhousing. Instead, they drifted into the kind of behavior that comes from assuming everyone around them is just as relaxed as they are. They didn't consider that someone with real experience doesn't see casual behavior the way they do. To a veteran, careless handling isn't harmless. It's a signal that someone hasn't learned the core lesson of dangerous work. You aren't just responsible for yourself. You're responsible for everyone in the room. The moment they struck the SEAL with a rifle, even lightly, it showed how far their respect had slipped. It wasn't the force of the hit that mattered. It was the mindset behind it. They had crossed the invisible line that separates confidence from recklessness, familiarity from disrespect, and training from reality. In that instant, the true meaning of respect in a high-stakes environment revealed itself, not through a lecture, But through the shift in the room, as the consequences of their mistake began taking shape, cadets often carry a picture in their heads of what a seasoned operator looks like. They expect someone loud, intense, permanently on edge. Someone who shouts commands the moment a recruit steps out of line. That image is easy to understand because it fits movies and stories passed around training halls. But real professionals, especially those who have gone through the level of conditioning a Navy SEAL endures, rarely match that picture. Their discipline shows in quieter ways. Their restraint shows in the way they move, the way they look at a situation, the way they decide when to act and when to stand still. The cadets in that room hadn't learned to read those signs. They saw calmness and misread it as softness. They saw patience and misread it as tolerance. They had no idea how much control sits beneath the surface of someone who has trained his mind and body to stay steady under pressure. Most people will never experience the SEAL, didn't hover over them, or correct every flaw in their form. He watched. He waited. He gave them room to work, not because he trusted their skill, but because he was letting them show him who they were. A disciplined person doesn't need to fill silence. He uses it. He uses observation as a tool, gathering information without letting emotion interfere. The cadets didn't understand that kind of presence. They thought discipline meant constant rigidity. So when they saw someone relaxed, they assumed it meant he wasn't paying attention. They didn't grasp that true discipline is something you carry even when no one is watching. And true awareness doesn't need to announce itself. Restraint is harder to recognize than strength. Anyone can act forceful. Anyone can raise their voice or make a threat. But restraint takes maturity. It takes confidence in your own abilities. It takes a calm understanding that reacting quickly isn't always the same as reacting well. The SEAL didn't snap when the cadets got sloppy. He didn't bark orders when their rifles drifted out of proper positions. He didn't show irritation when they joked in ways that crossed into carelessness. He held his ground with quiet patience, giving them space to correct themselves. That patience wasn't approval. It was controlled discipline. It was the kind of restraint that comes from years of managing danger with a level head. But the cadets saw none of this. Their inexperience turned restraint into something they dismissed. There's a gap between knowing a title and understanding what it represents. The cadets knew he was a Navy SEAL. They had heard the stories and knew the reputation. But information alone doesn't translate into comprehension. They couldn't see the miles of training behind his posture or the thousands of repetitions behind every small movement. They didn't see how his eyes scanned the room without drawing attention. They didn't recognize how he picked up on their shortcuts long before they realized they were taking them. In their minds, a SEAL should look like action. They didn't understand that real mastery often looks like stillness. When someone is that disciplined, they don't react to every provocation. They don't rise to challenges that don't matter. They don't flex for an audience. This confused the cadets. They were used to instructors who immediately corrected even minor errors. Instructors who raised their voices for emphasis or used physical presence to pull attention back into the room. When the SEAL didn't do that, they assumed they had more freedom. They felt comfortable pushing boundaries, not because they meant harm, but because they didn't realize he was letting them test themselves. They mistook his restraint for indifference, and by doing so, they drifted into behavior that someone with his background would never consider acceptable. The turning point was subtle. A shove with a rifle, but meant as a joke. A swipe of a barrel in someone's direction without thinking. Then the moment one cadet struck the SEAL, believing it would get a laugh, or at least show he wasn't intimidated. The act wasn't full of aggression. It was full of ignorance. They assumed that because the SEAL hadn't reacted before, he wouldn't react now. They didn't understand the line he had drawn in his own mind. They didn't understand that restraint has limits, and that each limit exists to prevent situations from escalating. They had stepped past a line they didn't even know existed. When they finally saw his response, it wasn't explosive. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the reaction they expected from someone with his level of training. It was measured, controlled, and precise. That alone shocked them more than any outburst could have. They realized too late that they had underestimated the discipline behind his silence and the restraint behind his calm. They understood, in the space of a few seconds, that the quietest person in the room was the one who had been in control the entire time, and that their mistake came from assuming control always looks obvious. A single bad decision rarely arrives with flashing lights. It slips into the room through something small, almost unnoticeable. A careless gesture. A joke that goes a little too far. A moment when someone decides the rules can bend because nothing bad has happened yet. That's how chains of events begin. They don't start with chaos. They start with someone thinking they're safe enough to stop paying attention. In that training room, the cadets were stacked with small choices that pushed them closer to a point they didn't see coming. Each shortcut, each careless movement, each moment of trying to impress each other added weight to the situation until one action tipped the whole thing over. The atmosphere made it easy to miss the warning signs. Nothing in the room felt tense. The drills weren't new. The routine felt familiar. When routine becomes too comfortable, people start believing they know exactly how things will go. That belief is dangerous because it creates blind spots. The cadets weren't scanning the environment the way experienced operators do. They weren't reading body language or sensing shifts in energy. They were riding the surface of the moment, assuming everything beneath it was stable. But environments that involve weapons, even unloaded ones, leave no room for assumptions. The smallest slip can trigger consequences. Every group has a tipping moment where someone could say, "Hold up," and pull the group back to discipline. That moment existed with the cadets too. It showed up when their rifle handling started to drift. It showed up when their jokes got a little too physical. It showed up when one cadet nudged another with the butt of his rifle, and everyone laughed instead of resetting their stance. If even one of them had paused to think, if even one had remembered why training rooms have strict rules, the chain might have broken. But group behavior has its own gravity. Once everyone starts leaning toward carelessness, it becomes harder for anyone to step out of the pattern. What makes a bad decision so influential is that it doesn't stay contained. It spreads. One person lets their guard down, and suddenly the others match their energy. People adjust to the level of seriousness they think the group is operating at. The cadets looked around and saw each other loosening up, so they loosened up more. They weren't calibrating off the SEAL because they assumed his calm matched theirs. They calibrated off each other's inexperience instead. When everyone in a room is following the same flawed example, it only takes one extra step to cross a line. They didn't even realize they were approaching. The decision that set everything off didn't look dramatic. It wasn't a violent strike or some furious act. It was a cadet swinging his rifle in a way he shouldn't have, clipped by the belief that it was harmless. To him, it felt like a joke, a bit of rough humor. But jokes become dangerous when they involve tools meant for combat. He didn't consider how it might be interpreted. He didn't consider who he was striking. He didn't consider what it means to touch a professional in that way. The gap between intention and consequence is wide, and the cadets were standing in that gap without realizing it. Once that strike landed, even lightly, the energy in the room flipped. The chain reaction that had been quietly building suddenly became visible. The SEAL didn't need to shout to make the shift clear. His posture changed. His focus sharpened. The cadets finally saw the weight of their mistake, not because he punished them immediately, but because they felt the sudden shift in authority. They realized that everything leading up to that moment had been leading somewhere, and they were the ones who pushed it forward. A bad decision matters most when it forces everyone involved to see the truth about their behavior. The cadets saw, all at once, how their earlier choices added up. The joking, the shortcuts, the belief that nothing serious would ever happen in a supervised room. They saw how easily a peaceful moment can turn into a corrective one. They also saw how quickly a professional can respond when boundaries are crossed. What they had mistaken as relaxed supervision was actually controlled observation. What they saw as harmless play had become a breach of respect. And what seemed like a harmless choice had triggered a lesson none of them would forget. That's the thing about bad decisions in environments like this. They don't just create consequences. They expose everything that led to them. They show who was paying attention and who wasn't. They show who understands the responsibility of holding a weapon and who still treats it like a toy. They show the difference between confidence and carelessness. The cadets learned this in one instant. And the moment that taught it began with a single choice that felt small right up until the second it wasn't. True authority doesn't come from how loud someone speaks or how intimidating they try to appear. It comes from skill that has been earned over time, from competence that's been tested under pressure, and from the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly what they're capable of. The cadets in that room didn't understand that kind of authority yet. They were used to instructors who relied on tone and posture to keep order. They were used to visible control, the kind you can spot from across the room. What they weren't used to was a different kind of presence, the kind where a person's steadiness says more than any raised voice ever could. The SEAL carried that kind of presence, but the cadets were too inexperienced to recognize its skill has a way of speaking without saying anything. Someone who has spent years sharpening their abilities doesn't need to perform. They don't need to show off. Their movements are precise without being dramatic. Their gaze is steady without being confrontational. They don't react to small provocations because they don't feel threatened by them. The SEAL's authority wasn't a performance. It was built into the way he stood, the way he watched the room, the way he stayed relaxed while still being fully aware of everything happening around him. The cadets mistook that quiet certainty for passivity because they didn't yet understand how real mastery works. The difference between earned authority and forced authority becomes obvious when things start to slip. Someone who relies on intimidation has to constantly maintain pressure, constantly remind others who's in charge. But someone whose authority comes from competence can stay calm because they know they can handle whatever happens. The SEAL didn't raise his voice when the cadets got careless. He didn't try to outshine their energy. He let them drift because he wasn't worried about losing control. True authority doesn't get rattled. It waits. It watches. It chooses the right moment to step in, not out of anger, but out of clarity. The cadets were drawn to the wrong signals. They judged authority by volume and tension, not by capability. They thought the lack of strict correction meant the SEAL wasn't fully engaged. They didn't realize he was reading them with every move they made, assessing their judgment, their discipline, and their respect. He didn't need to interrupt every mistake because he already understood each person's mindset long before the moment their behavior crossed the line. His silence wasn't weakness. It was evaluation. It was the kind of steady oversight that only comes from someone who has been in situations where overreacting can get people hurt. Skill reshapes how a person responds. When someone knows what they're doing, they don't waste energy. They don't get drawn into ego battles. They don't respond to taunts or reckless gestures. The SEAL didn't flinch when the cadets joked or handled their rifles with more enthusiasm than sense. He didn't let their immaturity pull him off balance. The cadets believed their behavior was harmless fun, but a trained operator sees deeper. He sees risk before it's visible. He sees habits forming. He sees how a team behaves when they think they're unobserved. That understanding creates a kind of authority no rulebook can teach. When the moment finally came and a cadet struck him with a rifle, even in a joking way, the SEAL's reaction made the difference unmistakable. There was no outburst, no dramatic show of anger, no need to dominate the room through force. His authority came through in how controlled his response was. The entire room felt the shift because they could see the difference between the boys they were acting like and the calm professional standing in front of them. It wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about fear. It was about showing the cadets what real capability looks like and how quickly it can redirect a situation when needed. The cadets realized, almost instantly, that they had misread him from the beginning. They understood that true authority isn't loud or impulsive. It doesn't come from trying to look tough. It comes from the kind of skill that doesn't need to prove itself. The SEAL didn't need to brag about his experience. He didn't need to remind anyone who he was. His actions, even the smallest ones, carried more weight than any speech could have. The cadets finally saw the gap between someone pretending to be in control and someone who actually is. Authority built on skill lasts because it doesn't depend on appearances. It doesn't fade when people stop watching. It stays steady in every situation, especially the ones where others start to panic or lose direction. The SEAL's response showed the cadets a version of strength they hadn't encountered before, one rooted in discipline, precision, and confidence instead of volume or aggression. They learned that someone who truly knows what they're doing doesn't need to raise a gun, a voice, or a fist to have full command of a room. They only need to act with the clarity that comes from earned skill, and everyone around them feels it immediately. The lesson didn't stay in that room. It followed every cadet who witnessed it, settling into their minds in a way no lecture ever could. Moments like that stick because they cut through theory and show the truth directly. You can study rules, memorize procedures, and repeat training steps 1,000 times, but real understanding usually comes from something you feel in your gut. The room had started out full of loose energy, joking, and a sense of invincibility. But after the strike, everything changed. The cadets saw the difference between pretending to understand discipline and actually understanding it. That shift leaves a mark, and once you feel it, you don't forget it. When the SEAL responded with calm precision instead of anger, the impact landed even harder. The cadets expected either a laugh or an explosion. They didn't get either. They got measured control. They got a response that showed capability without aggression and authority without theatrics. That kind of moment forces people to reevaluate everything they thought they knew. It strips away ego. It removes the safety of excuses. It makes you see your own behavior in a clearer light. Each cadet processed it differently, but they all felt the same thing. A sudden understanding of how serious the environment really was. The experience stayed with them because it exposed the gap between youthful confidence and real-world responsibility. Before that moment, the cadets believed they were ready for anything. They walked into training rooms thinking danger was something that only existed in stories or in the field somewhere far away. They thought that as long as the weapons were unloaded and an instructor was present, nothing could go wrong. But watching the SEALs' reaction showed them how quickly things can shift. It showed them that seriousness isn't something you turn on only when there's a threat. It's something you carry all the time, because the moment you set it aside is the moment you're most likely to make a mistake. The cadets also learned something about themselves. They saw how easily they had followed group energy instead of their own judgment. Not one of them had stepped up to reset the tone before things went too far. They realized they had been more focused on fitting in than on maintaining discipline. That's a lesson that reaches beyond training rooms. It shows up later in real missions, in difficult decisions, in moments when following the group could mean disaster. Understanding that tendency early can change a person's entire approach to teamwork. Another reason the lesson lasted is that it wasn't taught through punishment. Punishment can scare people into compliance, but fear fades. What doesn't fade is witnessing someone who embodies the standard you're expected to meet. The SEAL didn't shout or humiliate anyone. His reaction was controlled, efficient, and unmistakably confident. That kind of example sets a benchmark. It gives people something to measure themselves against. It shows what professionalism looks like up close. The cadets weren't just corrected. They were shown the difference between where they were and where they needed to be. The moment also highlighted how quickly respect can shift. For most of the morning, the cadets treated the SEAL like a background figure. Someone quiet. Someone they didn't think they had to take seriously. But the instant he responded, the room recalibrated. Respect snapped back into place, not because of fear, but because they saw his capability for what it was. That shift in perception is powerful. When you realize you've underestimated someone with real skill, it forces humility. That humility becomes the groundwork for growth as time passed. The cadets carried the memory into every future drill. They held their rifles differently. They paid more attention to spacing, posture, and tone. They watched their instructors more carefully. They understood that the calm professionals were often the ones they should be studying the closest. They learned to read silence, to value restraint, to recognize authority in subtle forms. Those adjustments didn't come from a lecture or a set of written rules. They came from experiencing the consequences of crossing a line they hadn't seen until it was too late. The story also traveled beyond the group. Other cadets heard about it. Instructors referenced it without needing to give details. It became the kind of quiet teaching moment that gets passed along because it carries a simple message. Discipline isn't optional, respect isn't negotiable, and mistakes don't stay small just because you intended them to. The cadets who lived it understood that message more deeply than anyone else because they felt the shift themselves. The lesson stayed with them because it wasn't just about a mistake. It was about who they were becoming. They walked into that room as students playing with the idea of discipline and walked out with a clearer understanding of what it actually demands. They learned that real professionalism comes from awareness, restraint, responsibility, and respect. And once you've seen those qualities in action, especially in a moment when everything could have gone wrong, you don't forget it.